What if I told you that history's most influential leader used psychological strategies so advanced that modern CEOs are just now catching up? Jesus didn't just gather 12 random followers, he orchestrated the most diverse leadership team ever assembled. A tax collector, fisherman, a zealot, and a future traitor. How do you control minds that different? The answer lies in 3 psychological secrets that will change everything you think you know about leadership. These aren't religious lessons. They're pure psychological warfare disguised as spiritual guidance. Ready to discover how one man turned chaos into the most powerful movement in human history? Here's what most people completely miss about Jesus' leadership. Everyone thinks he treated all his disciples the same way. Wrong. Dead wrong. This is the biggest misconception about his psychological approach. Jesus didn't use a one-size-fits-all strategy. He was running the most sophisticated personality-based manipulation system ever recorded. Look at the evidence. When Jesus called Matthew a despised tax collector, he didn't give him a moral lecture about corruption. Instead, he simply said, "Follow me," and immediately went to eat at Matthew's house with other tax collectors. But when he called Peter an impulsive fisherman, he used a completely different approach, a dramatic demonstration of power by filling Peter's nets with fish after a failed night of fishing. Why the different approaches? Because Jesus understood something that modern psychology calls personality-based persuasion. He wasn't just being nice. He was strategically adapting his communication style to match each person's psychological profile. Matthew needed acceptance without judgment. Peter needed proof of power and authority. This wasn't random kindness. This was calculated psychological profiling in action. Jesus studied each potential follower, identified their core psychological needs, and crafted a recruitment strategy specifically designed to exploit those needs. He knew that Simon the Zealot, a political extremist, needed to see revolution. So Jesus talked about overthrowing kingdoms. He knew that John, the introspective thinker, needed deep spiritual connection. So Jesus shared mystical teachings. The shocking truth? Jesus was essentially running a psychological assessment on everyone he met, categorizing them, and then using the exact psychological triggers needed to gain their loyalty. This wasn't divine inspiration, this was pure strategic psychology. Here's the psychological secret behind Jesus' recruitment mastery. He was using what modern psychology calls mirroring, combined with cognitive empathy. But he took it to a level that would make today's FBI profilers jealous. When Jesus approached each disciple, he didn't just mirror their personality, he became the solution to their deepest psychological void. Matthew, the tax collector, was socially isolated and desperate for acceptance. Jesus didn't just accept him, he publicly defended him, creating a psychological bond through social validation. Peter, the fisherman, was struggling with feelings of inadequacy and failure. Jesus didn't just encourage him, he gave him a new identity as the Rock, fulfilling Peter's need for significance and purpose. But here's where it gets truly mind-blowing. Jesus was simultaneously reading their psychological weaknesses and their strengths. Take Judas Iscariot. Historical analysis suggests Judas was likely struggling with ideological disappointment. He wanted a political revolutionary, not a spiritual teacher. Jesus saw this psychological tension but chose to keep Judas close anyway. Why? Because he understood that having someone with opposing viewpoints would actually strengthen the group's dynamics through healthy tension. This is advanced social psychology. Jesus was creating what researchers now call optimal team diversity, deliberately including complementary personality types that would challenge each other and create psychological balance. The impulsive Peter balanced the analytical Philip. The passionate Simon the Zealot balanced the practical Matthew. The doubting Thomas balanced the believing John. Every recruitment was a chess move. When Jesus called James and John the sons of thunder, known for their explosive tempers, he wasn't overlooking their anger issues. He was specifically recruiting them because he needed that psychological energy in his team. He even nicknamed them, which is a classic psychological technique called positive labeling that helps people embrace desired traits. The most revealing detail: Jesus never tried to change their core personalities. Instead, he channeled each person's existing psychological drives toward a common goal. This is what modern leadership psychology calls authentic leadership development, working with someone's natural psychological wiring rather than against it. Think about this like building the perfect basketball team. You don't recruit 5 point guards. You need different positions that complement each other. Jesus was doing the same thing, but with personalities instead of athletic skills. Imagine you're assembling a team to pull off the most ambitious project in history. You'd want different psychological types: the visionary, John; the enforcer, Peter; the strategist, Matthew; the revolutionary, Simon; the analyst, Thomas; and yes, even the potential betrayer, Judas, because every team needs someone who will ask the hard questions and challenge the leader. Jesus understood what psychologists now call cognitive diversity. Just like a symphony orchestra needs different instruments to create beautiful music, a leadership team needs different psychological instruments. The drums, Peter's boldness; the violin, John's sensitivity; the brass section, James and John's intensity; and the conductor, Jesus himself, bringing it all together. But here's the key insight: Jesus didn't just recruit diversity, he managed it. He knew Peter would deny him 3 times because Peter's psychological profile predicted it. He knew Judas would eventually rebel because Judas's personality type required it. He wasn't surprised by these failures. He was counting on them. This is next-level psychological chess. Jesus was playing a game where even the betrayals and denials were part of his strategic plan. He understood that authentic leadership means accepting people's psychological flaws and turning those flaws into strengths for the greater mission. Modern CEOs spend millions on personality assessments and team-building exercises trying to achieve what Jesus accomplished through pure psychological intuition. He saw people not as they were, but as they could become when their natural psychological drives were properly channeled. If this is exploding your head, hit that like button so more people can discover these hidden truths. But wait, because the second case is even more shocking. Here's the second psychological secret that will blow your mind. Jesus deliberately made himself vulnerable in front of his followers. But this wasn't weakness. This was the most sophisticated psychological manipulation technique ever recorded. Most leaders try to project strength and infallibility. Jesus did the opposite. He cried publicly when Lazarus died. He admitted he was troubled before his crucifixion. He asked his disciples to stay awake with him when he was afraid. Why would a leader deliberately show weakness to the people he's trying to control? Because Jesus understood something that modern psychology calls the vulnerability effect. People actually trust and follow leaders more when those leaders show strategic vulnerability. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. Jesus wasn't just being vulnerable randomly. He was carefully choosing when, where, and how to display weakness for maximum psychological impact. Look at the pattern. When Jesus washed his disciples' feet, he wasn't just being humble, he was demonstrating a complete power reversal that would psychologically bind them to him forever. This act violated every social norm of leadership and authority. The psychological impact was devastating. His followers couldn't rationalize this behavior through normal power dynamics, so they had to create entirely new psychological frameworks to understand him. This is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance resolution, When people can't understand someone's behavior through existing mental models, they become psychologically dependent on that person to provide the framework for understanding. Jesus was essentially hijacking his followers' psychological need for coherent worldview by being deliberately incomprehensible through normal leadership paradigms. But wait, it gets more manipulative. Jesus timed these vulnerability displays perfectly. He showed weakness right after demonstrations of power. Feed 5,000 people, then admit you're tired. Calm a storm, then say you need to pray alone. This psychological whiplash created an addiction-like dependence where his followers never knew which version of Jesus they would encounter. This isn't accidental. This is calculated psychological conditioning designed to keep his followers in a constant state of emotional investment and uncertainty. The psychological secret behind Jesus' vulnerability strategy is even more brilliant than you think. He was using what modern psychology calls intermittent reinforcement, the same technique that makes gambling addictive and creates the strongest psychological bonds possible. When Jesus showed vulnerability, he wasn't just building trust, he was creating psychological addiction. Think about it. His disciples never knew when Jesus would be the powerful miracle worker or the vulnerable human being. This unpredictability triggered their brains' reward systems in exactly the same way that slot machines do. The uncertainty created a constant state of psychological arousal that kept them emotionally hooked. But here's the genius part. Jesus strategically revealed different types of vulnerability to different disciples. To Peter, he showed vulnerability about leadership decisions, knowing Peter's psychology craved responsibility. To John, he showed emotional vulnerability, knowing John needed deep connection. To Thomas, he showed intellectual uncertainty, knowing Thomas's psychology required honest doubt. This is psychological profiling taken to an almost terrifying level. Jesus was customizing his vulnerability displays based on each follower's specific psychological needs. He wasn't just one leader showing weakness. He was essentially becoming whatever type of vulnerable leader each disciple needed him to be. The most disturbing example. When Jesus told his disciples he would be betrayed and killed, he wasn't just predicting the future. He was psychologically preparing them for the ultimate vulnerability display. He was essentially saying, I'm going to show you the most extreme weakness possible, and your psychological response to that weakness will determine your level of commitment to me. This is why the disciples' reactions to the crucifixion were so extreme. Jesus had spent years conditioning them to respond to his vulnerability with increased devotion. When he displayed ultimate vulnerability on the cross, their psychological programming kicked in, and they responded with ultimate commitment. Modern neuroscience shows that witnessing someone's suffering activates our brain's empathy centers and creates powerful emotional bonds. Jesus intuitively understood this neurological reality and weaponized it. He knew that his suffering would create deeper psychological bonds than his miracles ever could. The resurrection then becomes the ultimate psychological reward after the ultimate vulnerability. This created a neurological pattern of suffering followed by reward that would psychologically bind his followers to him forever. Picture the most skilled poker player at the table. They don't just play their cards, they show weakness strategically to make opponents overconfident, then reveal strength at the perfect moment to win everything. Jesus was playing psychological poker with his disciples' emotions. He would show vulnerability to draw them in deeper, then display power to prove his worthiness, creating a psychological gambling addiction where his followers couldn't walk away from the table. It's like watching a master manipulator in a movie. They don't control people through fear or force. They control them through carefully calculated emotional experiences. Jesus would make his disciples feel needed by showing vulnerability, then make them feel special by showing them power, then make them feel confused by mixing both, keeping them in a constant state of psychological engagement. Think about The most addictive TV shows you've ever watched. They work because you never know if the next episode will be tragic or triumphant. Jesus was essentially turning his daily interactions into a psychological drama series where his disciples were so emotionally invested that they couldn't stop watching even when the storyline became dangerous. But here's the brilliant part. Unlike modern manipulation, Jesus's vulnerability was often genuinely felt. This authenticity made it even more psychologically powerful. When someone shows you real fear, real sadness, real doubt, your brain's empathy centers activate more strongly than if they were just pretending. Jesus understood that true psychological power comes not from appearing invulnerable, but from showing calculated vulnerability that makes others feel psychologically necessary. He made each disciple feel like they were the only one who could understand and support him in his weakness. This created what psychologists call codependent loyalty. His followers didn't just believe in his mission, they felt psychologically responsible for his well-being. They couldn't abandon him without feeling like they were abandoning someone who truly needed them. And subscribe now, because the third case coming next will completely change your perspective on human nature. Here's the third and most disturbing psychological secret. Jesus didn't just recruit followers and show strategic vulnerability. He systematically converted his enemies into his most devoted disciples, using a technique that modern psychology has only recently understood. Think about this pattern. Paul, who persecuted Christians, became Christianity's greatest evangelist. Mary Magdalene, labeled as immoral, became one of his closest followers. Matthew, who collaborated with Roman oppressors, became a devoted apostle. Zacchaeus, a corrupt tax collector, gave away half his wealth after one conversation with Jesus. This wasn't random conversion. This was psychological warfare against people's core identity structures. Jesus was deliberately targeting individuals who had the strongest psychological reasons to resist him, and then breaking down their mental defenses using techniques that would make CIA interrogators jealous. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. Jesus used each person's strongest psychological defense mechanism as the entry point for conversion. Paul's intellectual pride. Jesus overwhelmed him with a mystical experience that his logic couldn't explain. Mary's shame about her reputation. Jesus offered radical acceptance that contradicted everything she believed about herself. Matthew's financial security. Jesus promised something more valuable than money. This is what psychologists call paradoxical intervention. You change someone by amplifying their resistance until it breaks. Jesus wasn't fighting against people's psychological defenses. He was using those defenses to create psychological collapse and rebuild people from scratch. The most terrifying example? When Jesus encountered the Pharisees, he didn't try to reason with them or gradually change their minds. Instead, he deliberately triggered their self-righteousness until it became so extreme that even they could see its absurdity. He was essentially forcing people to confront the logical contradictions in their own belief systems until those systems collapsed. This isn't gentle persuasion. This is psychological demolition followed by strategic reconstruction. Jesus understood that truly changing someone requires completely destroying their existing identity framework and replacing it with something entirely new. Modern cult experts recognize this pattern as one of the most powerful and dangerous psychological manipulation techniques ever developed. The psychological secret behind Jesus's enemy conversion strategy is so advanced that it reads like science fiction. He was using what modern psychology calls identity dissolution and reconstruction, essentially performing psychological surgery on people's sense of self. Here's how the technique works. Jesus would first identify someone's core psychological defense, their strongest source of identity and pride. Then he would create a situation where that defense became psychologically unsustainable. Finally, he would offer a new identity framework that resolved the psychological crisis he had created. Take Paul's conversion on the road. to Damascus. Paul's entire identity was built around being a righteous defender of traditional faith. Jesus didn't argue with this identity. He shattered it by revealing that Paul was actually persecuting the very God he thought he was serving. This created such massive cognitive dissonance that Paul's brain essentially had a psychological breakdown. The temporary blindness wasn't just symbolic. It was likely a genuine neurological response to psychological trauma. Then, Jesus did something brilliant. Instead of humiliating Paul, he offered him a new identity that was even more powerful than the old one. Paul went from being a local religious enforcer to being a global spiritual revolutionary. Jesus took Paul's psychological need for righteousness and redirected it toward a bigger target. But here's the most sophisticated part. Jesus understood that converted enemies make the most powerful allies because they have intimate knowledge of opposition psychology. Paul could counter every argument against Christianity because he had made those arguments himself. Mary Magdalene could reach other social outcasts because she understood their shame. Matthew could appeal to other collaborators because he knew their rationalizations. Jesus wasn't just converting individuals, he was strategically recruiting psychological specialists who could penetrate specific resistance networks. Each converted enemy became a psychological weapon designed to break down the same types of mental defenses they once possessed. The technique is so effective because it doesn't just change someone's beliefs, it hijacks their entire psychological operating system. When someone's core identity collapses and gets rebuilt around a new framework, they become psychologically incapable of returning to their previous state. The new identity becomes more fundamental to their sense of self than their original personality ever was. Modern neuroscience shows that this type of identity reconstruction literally rewires the brain's neural pathways. Jesus was essentially performing psychological brain surgery without anesthesia, then installing new mental software that made his followers psychologically dependent on their new identity framework for basic cognitive functioning. Imagine Jesus as a master hacker, but instead of breaking into computer systems, he was breaking into psychological systems. When a hacker wants to take control of a heavily defended computer, they don't attack the strong points. They find the system's greatest strength and turn it into a weakness. Think of someone's core identity like a fortress. Most people try to attack the walls directly and get defeated. Jesus was like a psychological engineer who would study the fortress's design, identify the strongest tower, and then figure out how to make that tower collapse and take the whole fortress down with it. Paul's fortress was built on religious certainty. Jesus didn't attack that certainty, he redirected it. Instead of being certain about persecuting Christians, Paul became certain about spreading Christianity. Same psychological foundation, completely different direction. The fortress didn't get destroyed, it got repurposed. It's like watching a master chess player who doesn't just capture your pieces. They force you to capture your own pieces. Jesus would create psychological situations where people's strongest convictions would lead them to conclusions that contradicted their original beliefs. But here's the terrifying genius. Once someone's psychological fortress gets rebuilt with Jesus at the center, it becomes even stronger than before. Converted enemies don't just believe in the new system. They become psychologically incapable of questioning it because questioning it would require them to admit they were wrong about everything. Twice. This is why former atheists often become the most passionate believers and former addicts become the most dedicated counselors. When your identity gets completely reconstructed around overcoming something, that new identity becomes more fundamental to your sense of self than your original personality ever was. Jesus understood that the human brain craves psychological consistency above almost everything else. By creating controlled identity crises and then providing new frameworks for self-understanding, he was essentially programming people to become psychologically dependent on their reconstructed identities. For basic mental stability, these 3 psychological secrets reveal the truth. Jesus wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was history's most sophisticated psychological strategist. He read personalities like code, weaponized vulnerability like a master manipulator, and converted enemies by breaking their minds and rebuilding them stronger. If these 3 cases exploded your mind, smash that like button and subscribe to not miss our next mysteries. Tell us in the comments, which revelation surprised you most? Hit the bell so the algorithm doesn't lie to you. And if you know someone who needs to see this, share it, because these truths need to be known. Until next time, keep questioning everything.